It's just a dog, man. Wrong. That dog saved more lives in Kandahar than your badge ever will. Travis Kroll thought he had just shot a homeless man's dog. But when that black man looked up steady, unshaken, and simply said, "You're both dead, men," that was the moment the entire state police system froze because they had just messed with the most dangerous living Delta Force commander. That morning, the intersection at Buchanan wasn't busy, only a few lazy birds cutting across the tangled web of power lines. On the sun-faded red brick sidewalk, a black man in a washed-out white t-shirt walked calmly beside a large ash-gray shepherd. Jasper didn't bark or run. He moved like he'd been trained his whole life not to step on flowers. Legs straight eyes forward, and every time he stopped, he turned to his owner, waiting for a nod. From inside the patrol car, Travis Kroll sipped his coffee and scanned the scene, thick eyebrows furrowed as if trying to find fault in every step the stranger took. No leash, no muzzle. And what kind of black king lets his dog piss on a city water post like that? He muttered with a half-laugh, half-sneer loud enough for the driver to hear. Jaden Roy sat silently in the passenger seat. He'd been on the force for less than a year too green to know when to intervene or when to look the other way. Travis flipped the turn signal, pulled over without cause. The car braked hard at the white line, dust curling up and falling slowly like smoke from a dead cigarette. Jasper froze ears up, then stepped back toward his owner's legs. The man didn't flinch, didn't glance at the patrol car. He bent down, rested a hand gently on the dog's back, and said something only Jasper could hear. Travis stepped out heels, hitting the curb like a drumbeat. No question, no greeting, no ID shown. His eyes slid from the man's hands to his shoulder, stopping at a long scar running from neck to chest visible through the thin shirt. "What's your name? You think this is some war zone picnic ground for drifters?" he barked, not waiting for an answer. The man turned his head slowly, deliberately. In the soft sunlight, his face showed lines shaped by time like every right and wrong decision had once passed through those deep, dark eyes. He said evenly, "His name is Jasper. He saved 5 lives in Kandahar. As for me, I don't need a cop to know who I am." His thick lashes didn't blink. His back didn't bend in front of a gun. And for a split second, Travis felt something he couldn't name, pointing straight at his heart. The silence that followed wasn't the kind found in funerals or lecture halls. It was the kind that forces the other person to either keep talking just to avoid the emptiness or do something loud, something forceful to drown the discomfort rising from the hollowness of their own power. Travis chose the latter. He scoffed, pressing his hand on the taser strapped to his belt. Jaden glanced over, lips parted to speak, but swallowed the words when he saw Travis's mouth tighten. The talking was done. Now came the action. But the man didn't move. Neither did Jasper. He sat down, head slightly tilted as if sensing the tension thickening in the air. A fly buzzed between them, but no one flinched. The sun climbed higher, casting Jasper's shadow on the sidewalk like a sharp black gash. No one on that street knew that in the next 5 minutes, a chain of irreversible events would unfold. And in the end, what would shock the entire nation wasn't the sound of a gun. It was the words spoken by the black man standing at the edge between justice and permitted arrogance. "You two should think carefully," he said, voice steady, neither loud nor low, because not everyone today will be lucky enough to lose just a dog. Travis squinted. Jaden stood still, sweat breaking out along both temples. Jasper remained seated calm as someone who had once waited for teammates to return through gunfire. And in that moment, the city was still asleep, but history had just woken up. Heat began to rise from the pavement, blurring the shadows beneath the trees. The park seemed drained of sound, leaving only the short growl of the patrol car's engine before it fell silent. Travis Kroll stepped back toward the vehicle, his steps heavy like he was punishing every paving stone. He opened the rear hatch, unlatched the taser, and rolled his wrist loose. From where he stood, he glanced at Jasper with a probing stare. No muzzle, no vet tag, and sitting still like some stone bench, Should I call animal control or the stray dog unit first? His voice was metallic, flat, emotionless. But Malark knew someone like Travis was waiting for a reason, and that was more dangerous than any weapon. Jaden Roy stepped back slightly off to the side of the car, hand hovering at his belt but not drawing anything. Wind brushed his shirt a fleeting moment, suspended between stepping in and staying silent. He spoke low, just enough for Travis to hear, "Don't. Service dog. Look at how it's sitting, straight back under control. It's waiting for a command." Travis didn't turn his head, but his lip curled. "You learn law from TikTok." And without another second, he raised his hand and pulled the trigger. The electric crack tore through the space between them. A short, blue arc struck Jasper's spine like an invisible whip. The dog let out a cry, a sound cut off before it could finish caught in its throat. Every muscle locked tight, and the large frame collapsed to one side, shuddering in waves. Malark didn't move at first. He stood frozen like a statue in a scene warped by that one single act. Then he stepped forward calmly without rush, knelt beside Jasper, and wrapped his arms around him. One side of the dog's face was pressed into the dirt, its left eye barely open like it was trying to find where the light had gone. Malark leaned close and whispered, his hand resting gently on the dog's trembling belly. "You just triggered something you had no authority to touch." Travis advanced. His face flushed, whether from anger or the weight of watching eyes was unclear. A mother across the street slowed her stroller phone, raised for a photo. Two elderly joggers who had been watching from the start finally stopped. Jaden stayed frozen, face-pale, fingers twitching near the trigger but stopping short. Travis didn't care. He drew the steel cuffs, walked straight toward Malark, and pinned his elbow to the pavement. The move was instinctive, drilled from hundreds of arrests, but this time there was no resistance. And that calm, that stillness, drove Travis insane. He leaned down, lips near Malark's ear, and growled, "I'm arresting you for obstructing law enforcement, and for looking at me in a way that made me feel smaller than a dog." An excuse had been manufactured. A personal offense had been used as grounds for an arrest, and an animal that once carried its name on a battlefield plaque thousands of miles away now lay in the quiet streets of America, trembling, soaked in sweat, eyes wide open in unconscious shock. But what Travis didn't realize was that his anger wasn't truly aimed at Jasper, nor entirely at Malark. It was at what he saw reflected in those eyes, the sharp, undeniable image of how small and exposed his power really was, a power he once believed to be absolute. No ambulance siren sounded. No one called, because they didn't know what they were witnessing. A minor infraction, a burst of senseless violence, or the moment an entire system of habits was stripped bare by a single look. But in the heart of that park, 3 men and 1 dog had cracked the first line in a wall thought to be untouchable. And that crack would spread quickly, not through force, but through something Travis hadn't counted on: the gaze of bystanders, slowly raising their phones, recording without a word. Jasper lay still, trembling with each slowing breath, and Malark, hands cuffed, head still held high, stared directly at Travis. No need to shout. He only had to let Travis see himself through the eyes of a dying dog and a man who had never bowed. Jasper lay still on the sidewalk like a slab of stone broken off from a hill of memories. His chest rose and fell with painful effort, each breath tugging at the patch of skin on his back where the electricity had struck. The rapid breathing pulled dust into clumps along his fur, dampened by saliva not yet swallowed. Beside him, Malark sat, cuffed one of Travis's knees, pressing lightly against his left shoulder, not hard enough to injure, but enough to signal he could use more force if he wanted. Jaden stood behind them, eyes downcast, staring at the pavement, as if the answer to what he couldn't understand might be buried there. The wind was still, no sirens. Just a few passers-by began to stop, each holding a phone like they'd seen this too often, yet still unsure whether whether this time they should step in. Malark looked at Jasper, unmoving. Only his lips moved slightly, just enough for the dog to hear, not enough for others to catch the words, "Stay calm. I'm still alive because I know when to wait." It wasn't comfort. It was a reminder to himself, to the dog, and to the force tightening around them like invisible wire. The patience of someone who had walked through death zones without ever firing a shot. In the crowd, a young woman quietly lifted her phone, filming from a low angle, tapping the screen to focus on both the dog's and the man's faces. She didn't know why she was doing it, only that she should. Travis lifted his head, catching the last word of the quiet sentence, and the irritation inside him suddenly had a shape. He barked loud enough to silence his own pulse. "Shut your mouth. Just another thing drifting around wars no one asked for." But Malark didn't drop his gaze. He raised his head, the cuffs already cutting into skin, and spoke each word like reading from a report he'd written himself. "Wrong. I didn't drift. I went through, and I lived. No word wasted." Travis paused for half a second, and that hesitation made him angrier. He slammed Malark's head down on the patrol car's hood. A sharp crack echoed, splitting the skin on his forehead, and blood instantly trickled past his brow. An elderly woman standing about 20 feet away gasped instinctively before thinking, "My God, he didn't even do anything." Her voice shook, but no one in the crowd told her to be quiet. More phones lit up, recording without a signal. The silence became something like a courtroom without lawyers, without a judge, only living evidence and the weight of stillness like a stone. Jasper was still breathing, eyes closed, ears twitching at every loud noise. Malark's face tilted toward the patrol car's side mirror, blood from his forehead trailing down the bridge of his nose, dripping at the corner of his mouth. In the dusty reflection, he saw himself, bloodied head, pinned hands, cuffed, but his eyes held steady. No flicker, no blink. As if that stare wasn't meant for any one person, but was a silent indictment aimed at an entire system too used to doing wrong and writing reports to make it right. Jaden wavered. In his mind, the voice of his old academy instructor echoed faintly. "You have to know when to step in and when to step back." But between what should be done and what he was trained to do, the distance wasn't just a few steps. It was an entire career, a paycheck, a team. The scornful stares of those who had long learned to decapitate every issue with the word protocol. He looked down at Jasper, then up at Malark, then over to Travis. His throat was dry, his hands unsure whether to hold his weapon or raise them, and he stood still. Like so many before him had stood still when the wrong wasn't clear enough to name, but the right was too quiet to protect. A baby in a stroller burst into tears. The mother quickly pushed it away, but the cry was the only sound loud enough to snap reality back into place. Something had gone too far. This was no longer a patrol. It was suppression made legal by uniform and selective silence. Travis brushed his hands, stepped back, not bothering to look at Malark again. He returned to the driver's seat, started the engine, and growled at Jaden, "Get in. Write the report. Charge him with defiance and keeping an uncontrolled animal." But as the engine turned over, the silence behind them didn't go away. It stretched, clinging like a shadow that wouldn't detach. And in the car mirror, the reflection of a bloodied man who hadn't gone down on his knees, staring straight into the windshield, remained. Like a warning not yet put into words, but already echoing through the hearts of those who dared to look back, but hadn't yet dared to speak. The sound of the car door slamming shut behind him was cold and blunt, like a sentence already signed. Malark sat in the back seat, wrists still cuffed his back against the worn cushion. Dried blood cracked across his forehead, trailing down his cheek, rough, like dust caked over an old victory. No one spoke as the car pulled away from Buchanan Park. Travis gripped the wheel with one hand, the other clenched tight around the gear shift, each acceleration grinding through his throat. Jaden sat in the passenger seat, his eyes occasionally occasionally drifting to the rearview mirror, never staying long but unable to stay away. Travis turned on the radio like a detox ritual for the air in the car. A female anchor's voice came through, steady reading traffic reports and pollution indexes in the area. No one really listened, but the sound became a thin wall between the three of them, trying to keep what had just happened from spilling out. Millark quietly tilted his head, leaning fully into the seat, then spoke, voice flat and dry like earth after an explosion. The radio's not loud enough to drown the footsteps of the military when they enter a lawsuit. No one replied, but the air inside the car tightened like a lemon squeezed in a thick-veined hand. Jaden turned, looking through the mirror. For the first time, his eyes met the stare of the man in the back, not out of curiosity, but because something in that voice made him feel like it deserved confirmation. "You really served?" he asked quietly, not with authority, but honest enough to make Millark stir. He pulled a gray cloth from his left shirt pocket, folded in quarters edges, frayed by time. Unfolded at the center was a faded set of dark letters, DFC-11. No emblem, no decoration, no explanation needed. Only those who'd been in that unit knew what value such a scrap of fabric carried. Travis glanced over his shoulder, then scoffed. "You think we're scared of a few letters? Delta Force is just TV, flashy actors, and fake missions." The air inside the car cooled even with sunlight cutting through the windshield. Millark stared at the back of the front seat and spoke quietly, like someone reteaching a basic truth. "I don't need you to be scared. I just need you to remember. Jasper is the last name you'll say freely for the rest of your life." It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't an insult. It carried the tone of something already done, no further evidence needed. A statement, a farewell not to the dead, but to the overconfidence of temporary power. Jaden turned his head fully forward, saying nothing more. Travis clenched his jaw, but didn't fire back. Something in that voice made him not want to hear more. Not out of fear, but because what he'd just heard didn't sound like language he could control with laws or a baton. The radio stopped suddenly. No one touched a button. The sound was cut mid-sentence, as if even the outside world didn't want to intrude on that conversation. Inside the car, only the low hum of the engine and breathing remained. Travis exhaled through his nose, long and forceful, like a way to confirm he still had control over the space. But the only thing truly holding the air in place was the silent presence of Millark, the man in the back seat, cuffed, not struggling, not resisting, not arguing. And that, more than anything, made the silence in the car take on a new form of sound. The sound of unease, the kind no trigger could silence. Outside, the building sat still in the Sunday morning light, as if the city was pretending to sleep just to avoid witnessing. And within that supposedly peaceful city, three people inside a patrol car were moving through two wars at once. One was the physical drive toward the station, the other a psychological crossing where the roles of aggressor, victim, and witness kept shifting with every glance. Millark didn't close his eyes, but he didn't look at anyone either. His gaze slid past judgment, resting in a depth no one else could reach, a place where a name had just been shot to the ground, and from it the whole country would have to re-examine the kind of power it once believed was lawful. The patrol car cruised steadily down the boulevard from Buchanan toward the Riverdale District Police Headquarters. No sirens, no rush. Inside, no one spoke. Millark sat in the back seat, hands cuffed, back straight, his gaze deep and steady as if peering through the windshield to read the ending ahead. Next to him, Jasper was wrapped in the faded white t-shirt, the heavy body now shrunken, as if folded into memory. The chest no longer rose and fell. A faint trace of blood clung to the fur near the belly, the head slightly tilted against the seat, still seeming to look toward the man it had always walked beside. Travis drove with one hand, the other quickly dialing the internal dispatch line, his voice flat and forcedly calm. One subject resisting hostile behavior, raised voice showing signs of obstructing law enforcement. But before he could finish the sentence, Millark spoke, not loud, not rushed, as if reciting a previously recorded testimony. "You just lied. I have it on record." The car seemed to pause for a beat. Jaden turned around, eyes wide. On what he asked, not entirely to confirm, but hoping it was a bluff, Malark didn't answer right away. He just tilted his head slightly to the right, then tapped a finger lightly on the button of his shirt, 3 times, very softly. The sound was barely audible, but the impact was immediate. Travis broke into a sweat along his hairline. He didn't ask anything further, just glanced briefly at the rearview mirror and gripped the steering wheel tighter. In his head, every conversation since the park rewound like a tape spinning backward. He didn't know whether lines like, "You made me feel smaller than a dog," or "I'm sick of your soldier morality" had made it into the recording, but his gut told him it was already too late. Delta Force is TV nonsense. Travis barked out a dry laugh, trying to reclaim control with a mocking tone, but it came out warped inside the sealed cabin. "I'm sick of your soldier morality. You're not getting out of that back seat." The only sound left was the steady hiss of the air conditioner. Malark looked into the rearview mirror, his eyes locking onto Travis's like a reply in image form. "I've walked out of crashing planes, out of firestorms, out of burned soldiers. You think I'm afraid of this cheap cop car seat?" An answer not found in any police handbook. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't provocation, it didn't qualify as a threat, but the way it was delivered, as if the man in custody knew the law better than the one enforcing it, thickened the air in the vehicle. Jaden swallowed hard. Travis exhaled through his nose, trying to reclaim authority by adjusting the radio. But the radio was already off. No music, no news, nothing to fill the gap left behind by what he couldn't control, the absolute calm of a man with nothing left to lose. Malark's face turned slightly to the right, looking out the window where sunlight hit the shirt wrapped around Jasper. He spoke the words released into the tight cabin, spreading through the air like smoke after an explosion. "You're both dead men. Not in the literal sense, but because the entire system behind you will have to answer for a dog that died under your command." The sentence didn't rise in volume at the end, had no exclamation, and didn't emphasize any particular word. Yet it echoed as if a heavy gate had just closed behind the leaving, no way back. Jaden looked down, meeting no one's eyes, but his hand had long since moved away from his belt. Travis pressed the gas instinctively, even though the road ahead was clear. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as if clinging to the only thing still under his control. But deep down, he knew he had gone too far. Not because of Malark's words, but because of the eyes in the back seat, eyes that didn't ask for justice, didn't cry for fairness, but quietly returned every wrong action to where it belonged, reports, evidence, and the law. And for the first time, Travis realized that he, not the man under arrest, was the one who needed to prepare for questioning. Not at the station, but somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't accept reports written with ego, where a dead dog wasn't the start of an incident, but the point where an entire presumed order would be turned inside out. The car kept moving, but everyone inside knew they were no longer on the same journey. And Jasper, though his body was cold, still lay there between two colliding worlds where no one dared admit they had already lost. That night, while the city slept and the streets still steamed faintly from the day's heat, social media lit up as if someone had struck a match to Justice's dry old straw. A 23-second clip spread like wildfire on TikTok, Reddit, then Twitter, Telegram, every platform already trained to digest outrage like a late-night snack. The video had no soundtrack, no flashy edits. It began with a black man in handcuffs, blood running from his forehead, sitting in a patrol car beside a dog loosely wrapped in a white t-shirt. But what kept viewers watching wasn't the blood, not even the dog's death. It was the man's eyes staring into the rearview mirror, not apologetic, not afraid, not angry. Cold, deep, and absolutely unpleasant. The clip was titled "He Didn't Even Flinch," and in just 3 hours it hit 1 million views. People online didn't talk about the cops first. They talked about the man. Some said he was special forces, others thought he had done time. Many argued whether the dog had really been trained or not, but what was strange was that no one painted him as a threat, because even without captions, profiles, or credentials on screen, that look in his eyes told them this was not someone you cuff and turn your back on. In one top comment, someone wrote, "I've seen that look before," on my commander's face the year he came back from Afghanistan. The look of someone with nothing left to lose but everything still remembered. Hashtags started sprouting like roots pushing up through the ground. Justice for Jasper, dead men, walking, who is he? And every time someone tapped one of those tags, thousands of comments opened up like the whole country was turning up the volume to hear the silence inside those 23 seconds. An anonymous account named simply C-11 Survivor posted a photo on Reddit. A torn, faded gray cloth with just 3 clear letters, DFC11. Caption, "Don't believe he's Delta. I served under him once and lived to write this." No face attached, no verification needed, but over 10,000 users hit the upvote button as if trust was already flowing in their blood. Many comments followed asking, who is he? What happened in Kandahar? Why does one look stop a cop from turning around? A well-known YouTuber in the military community, a former Marine, posted a reaction video. I don't know his name, but I know the type of man he is. He's the kind who never yells during training, never repeats an order. They just look, and we the ones trained not to flinch still lower our heads when we meet them. The video hit 500,000 views in just 5 hours. The description didn't link to any fundraiser, didn't tag Malark's account. It had only one sentence. If he really is Delta, then maybe we just witnessed a historic moment where a dog was killed, and an entire country had to face the consequences. On Twitter, a few legal experts began debating the legality of using force on a non-aggressive animal. A former judge wrote, "This case might reopen the entire framework for police accountability when killing a service animal." But people weren't following the case just for the law. They watched the clip for what was behind the law, something unwritten that still gnawed at you when you looked back. A dog, a man who didn't scream, a cop who didn't realize he was being filmed from every angle, and a nation that once thumped its chest claiming justice always prevails now faced with the question, did justice ever know Jasper's name? At a small high school in Pennsylvania, a civics teacher played the clip as an opener for class discussion. A girl in the back row quietly asked, "Why didn't he get mad?" Normal people would have made a scene, and the teacher simply said, "Some people don't have to react because the whole world will react for them." On Facebook, a post spread quickly from a parent. I don't know who he is, but my kid just asked me, "Mom, if I died, would your eyes make people listen like that?" In one night from a short clip, people didn't share just because something wrong had happened. They shared it because something deeper was shifting, something bigger than the scream carried instead by the uncanny calm of a man who knew exactly when to stay silent so the world would speak for him. And from the shaky footage of an anonymous phone, the question began to spread like oil on water. Who is he and why? Does his gaze make us feel so small? The Georgia State Internal Affairs Office sat tucked behind the Central Administrative Complex, a white concrete building with glass doors reflecting the gray sky where every out-of-line action by law enforcement was dissected in detail. On Monday morning, while public frenzy still surged over the video, he didn't even flinch. An internal investigation unit was urgently assigned, not because Jasper had died, and not entirely because the clip had gone viral, but because of one strange, unprecedented detail. The Southeastern Military Command had sent an official memo requesting notification if the arrested individual in the footage was named M. Allen. No explanation, no context, just one line, for reasons of strategic security. On the third floor, Lieutenant Elise Parks, lead investigator on police conduct, sat in front of her computer screen, eyes fixed on the interagency search software. The name Malark Allen appeared in the search bar linked to a military file code. But when she clicked Access, a command window popped up showing a single glowing red line: restricted, top secret/SCI. Unauthorized access is a federal offense. Elise frowned and turned to the IT advisor next to her. The thin man, glasses slipping down his nose, slowly shook his head and whispered, "To open that file, you'd need clearance at a general's level. Anyone who touches it is considered a threat to national security." Elise leaned back in her chair, paused, then typed a high-priority email to the Pentagon. She didn't expect a reply, but less than 30 minutes later, a brief message arrived from a Defense Department stamped address. "Advise no contact with subject MA. Any action taken against him will be considered damage to high-level strategic interest." Elise didn't know who MA was and didn't need to guess. From the moment that response was printed, the entire investigation shifted focus to Travis Kroll, the only person now unaccounted for. He hadn't returned home the night before, hadn't shown up at the precinct, and when Internal Affairs called his phone, it didn't ring. The police chief issued an emergency summons, but the location team found only his personal vehicle parked at his house. Travis's phone had been smashed, tossed next to the toilet, battery pulled, and SIM card snapped in half. On the internal GPS system, the last recorded route was from headquarters to his home, after which the signal went dead. All trip data had been wiped from the patrol car, and his access card had been deactivated. When the special response team arrived at Travis's home, they found the door unlocked, the apartment undisturbed but nearly empty of belongings. Muddy footprints trailed across the floor to the bathroom. No blood, no signs of struggle. But in the bedroom, where sunlight filtered through torn gray curtains, there was one thing that made the entire team stop. On the fogged surface of a large mirror, a message had been written in black marker, the strokes firm and clear. "I'm not here for revenge. I just want my friend's name carved in stone." There was no signature, but the voice in their heads was unmistakable. This was not something Malark would ever write down, because he didn't need to. He made people understand on their own. The room was immediately sealed off, forensics scanned for fingerprints, but only found Travis's. Every detail of his private life was re-examined, and for the first time in the state's internal affairs history, they encountered an inconvenience: they couldn't open a soldier's file. Not because information was missing, but because some files had been locked at the federal level, places local police had no authority to query, let alone question. Jasper was dead, but the one still alive was a variable the civilian justice system had never had to face. A man who didn't need to appear, didn't need to command, didn't need to claim innocence. He only needed to sit still and let everything once called procedure turn inward on itself. Internal Affairs made no public statement. They quietly changed the focus of the investigation from disorderly conduct to severe civil rights violation. And the name Malarka Allen, once absent from any civilian database, was now locked into the system with a warning label: "Do not engage without federal approval." In a military cemetery in South Carolina, where rows of white headstones stood in perfect order, a night guard received a small folded note left by someone: Jasper Shepherd. Died on the 14th. No medals, but silent enough to make a nation speak again. He folded the paper, placed it in his pocket, and filed no report. Because some deaths don't need to be certified. They verify themselves by making the living stop. And right. On Tuesday night, the national MPN channel aired a special extended live talk show dedicated solely to a 23-second clip. A still image of Jasper, the dog, lying motionless on the car seat, head tilted, eyes half closed, appeared on screen. The black man in handcuffs, dried blood on his forehead, didn't look at anyone but held the audience's gaze firmly. Usually the studio was silent in the first minutes, but this time phones buzzed and tables tapped backstage. Malik Dreyer, the host with salt and pepper hair and a steady voice, struggled that night to keep his usual tone. The first guest criminal law expert, Professor Hendrik Cole, placed his hand on a printout of the crime scene. This isn't just about killing an animal. It's about who has the right to decide life or death just because they wear a uniform. He didn't need to specify Jasper was a dog or who Malark was. Everyone watching already knew. The question was no longer what happened, but why did it happen so quietly? Malik nodded and opened the call line. A student from Illinois spoke up, voice cracking at first, but clear with every word. "I don't know what Delta Force is, but I know what it means to hurt when you see a dog killed and its owner forced silent for fear of being shot next." No one in the studio responded. The camera panned to a middle-aged woman in the audience, her eyes wet, gripping her jacket as if holding something precious inside her chest. Backstage, the production manager quickly fed online comments onto a large screen. Malik read aloud one, "Maybe if the victim were human, we'd be more likely to forget. But because it was a dog and it was silent, we feel more disturbed." Soft sighs rose not from the audience but from the technical crew, who usually adjusted sound levels but now sat silent as if listening to a hearing no one dared skip. Malik didn't comment. He just looked up at the camera and said, "We're not talking about the dog. We're talking about how silence made the whole country speak." The channel replayed the clip again, this time muted. Each frame was slowed down. When Malark's eyes met the rearview mirror, the entire studio seemed frozen. A front-row journalist whispered, "I've written hundreds of stories about abuse of power, but never seen eyes that without a single word make the system question itself." That comment wasn't aired, but was transcribed by the post-production team and posted on the show's official social media. Within 2 hours, it received over 70,000 shares. At the end of the program, Malik said one final sentence not in the script. Just one line, but it became the most quoted phrase that night, even more than the original clip. "We don't need heroes. We need deaths not silenced by routine." 11 words. And the whole country started losing sleep over a death that said nothing, yet forced millions to reconsider how they live. Because Jasper is not a symbol, nor a metaphor. Jasper is real. And someone, by the habit of assuming the power to choose life or death, made that truth the first evidence in an unprecedented reckoning. The small living room where Jaden Roy lived alone held only the slow rotation of the ceiling fan drifting silently through heavy beats. All the lights were off, only the glow from his phone screen lit his face, shining straight into eyes darkened by nearly 2 sleepless nights. Jaden's finger moved slowly across the screen, pausing on the moment he had watched 16 times, the image of a black man leaning close to a dying dog, lips moving with words only Jasper could hear. The original audio in the clip was almost inaudible, but the auto-generated subtitles showed the phrase the online community had pieced together, short and broken into an unusual quiet message: "Stay. You don't have to fight anymore." That moment lasted less than 3 seconds. No blood, no yelling, no physical resistance, yet it made everything else in the video seem redundant. Jaden hit replay and reply. Each viewing stirred something in his chest, not quite guilt, not quite regret, but a clear awareness that he had been there, yet not truly present. His hand held a cold glass of water, but his pulse still raced. Those eyes, the gaze Malark left in the rearview mirror, remained etched in Jaden's memory like an unsigned indictment. He remembered every moment Travis shouted, every jerk on the taser, every slam of the soldier's head against the hood. But along that whole path, he did not intervene, did not object, did not draw his weapon, step back, or step forward. He had stood still like dozens of other witnesses. And now, sitting here with a 6-inch screen replaying a recording he might have helped stop, Jaden saw one thing clearly: he had never stood on the right side, even though deep down he had always believed he wasn't on the wrong one. Neutrality, he realized, was not as harmless as they taught in training. Neutrality in an invasion is surrender, cloaked in silence. Jaden opened his laptop and typed an anonymous email to the Internal Affairs Office. No name, no location, just one sentence without any fancy word. The man did not resist. "I confirm." He wrote nothing more about Malark's identity, said nothing about the dog, and did not recount details, because he knew all the evidence was online and the only thing missing was a confirmation from the inside, a statement he should have made the moment Travis stepped forward to break the cuffs. He read the line twice, then hit send. No waiting for confirmation, no saving a draft. Outside the window the night passed as any other, but inside, Jaden, a small cut had just opened, not to bleed, but to breathe. No one called his name online, no one demanded his testimony. Yet those eyes, that face, that whispered voice had chosen him to remember. And Jaden understood that from this moment he would have to make a real choice, either stay on the sidelines or stand with the gaze that never once wavered, even amid a storm it never caused. On TikTok, among countless dancing, dubbed and over-edited videos, one still image continued to spread. Malark Allen hands cuffed behind his back, blood dripping from his forehead, eyes locked on the rearview mirror, unblinking, unwavering, unflinching. People froze, that frame made it a symbol, then tagged it simply #flinchless. No explanation was needed. Anyone who had seen the clip knew that moment wasn't scripted or acted. It was the essence of thousands of encounters with life and death without a scream. The first comment under the video with 500,000 views read, "This is not a soldier. This is the silent strength that makes the system afraid." A statement that neither called for overthrow nor carried political zeal, but struck like a hammer on the heads of those who thought order could be controlled by uniform and siren alone. Every time the clip resurfaced online, the perspective shifted. Some analyzed Travis's expression to gauge psychological shock. Others focused on Jasper's stillness as proof it posed no threat. But no matter the angle, the heart of the story always returned to the breaking point, the unwavering gaze of a man who had just lost the dog that once survived Kandahar with him. That steadiness made even those indifferent to the military law or civil rights pause, not because they understood, but because they felt something long ignored, like background music playing unnoticed in the city until it suddenly stopped. And now, with Jasper's breath gone, everyone was shocked to realize what his life had quietly underpinned, something steadier than any law. One unexpected comment rose to the top overnight, not from a famous account, but from a single mother in Louisiana. The dog didn't howl a second time, but society shouldn't stay silent anymore. That sentence carried no hashtag. It didn't repeat the flood of justice for Jasper sweeping the net. It just stood there, unadorned, unemotional, but piercing, the very reason why this clip couldn't fade, like so many other police exposure videos in internet history. Because this time it wasn't a person speaking first, but the death of a creature not protected by law like a human. And if a whole community that once saw black lives as a debated issue felt pain watching a dog fall, then clearly the problem no longer lies in skin color, but in who is allowed to hurt and who must die in silence. Malark did not speak afterward. He didn't post. He didn't appear on talk shows. But his silence became the sharpest sound throughout the entire chain of events. Every unblinking look, every nod in the investigation file, every second of stillness in the patrol car, all combined into a wall of silence that no official, no excuse could break. People began asking in reverse what made a man endure his dog being shot without flinching. And from there, a deeper question surfaced. What makes a society so used to seeing victims shrink away that this time it's the one who stands still who becomes the center? Jaden Roy, reading that comment from his home in the trending section, did not reply. But inside, each word felt rewritten into a space he had left empty, the posture of a man. Not in uniform, but in the choice of where to stand when truth no longer belongs to the loudest voice, but to the one silent enough for truth to sound in its true tone. And now, as Malark's gaze continues to flow through millions of views, the hashtag #flinchless is no longer just a mark. It is a new measure of courage, not avoidance, not exaggeration, not struggling, but holding your spine straight until the world can no longer pretend to sit still. On the 6th floor of the Georgia Department of Justice, where dark wood paneling covered the walls and tension filled the air, despite no one having spoken, a fax was passed to the chief legal advisor's desk less than 10 minutes after an email from the Pentagon arrived in the state's secure mailbox. Each word in the official letter was brief, avoiding grandiose language, yet it radiated an urgency beyond ordinary administrative matters. Urgent summons for investigation of individual Travis Kroll, ID CA2389, for use of force causing strategic damage to national defense personnel. Any rogue actor against lawful military personnel will be prosecuted as a threat to Homeland Security. No further explanation, no attached files, only an electronic seal bearing the Department of Defense's code and one name mentioned as the case's focal point, Malark Allen. 3 hours after the email arrived, the indictment was signed. The federal judge approved expedited proceedings, bypassing preliminary hearings. This was no longer an internal police matter, nor was it a single administrative case. It was a rare moment in state judicial history where a citizen was tried under strategic security law typically reserved for those threatening bases, breaching codes, or causing unrest during wartime. Travis Kroll, a police sergeant accustomed to wielding authority at quiet intersections, had now become the defendant in an urgent government file stamped in red. No civil defense attorney on the list would take the case, understanding this was not simply a trial to decide right or wrong. For the first time, a rarely seen underground force stepped forward to assert the boundary between civil law and military honor. In the halls outside the Judicial Council, a CBS reporter sought comment from a retired general who had once commanded the southern region and held significant sway over federal decisions. He had just left a closed session holding an internal memo. When asked why the summons was signed so urgently, he paused, said nothing at first, then, after a few seconds, eyes fixed on a distant place, as if recalling a battlefield, he spoke slowly. Because the man you arrested once shielded American soldiers' bodies from bullets without need for medals. Then he walked away. No further comment. At that moment, in another state, the television system began updating official announcements that the Department of Justice had opened a federal case on the JASPER incident. The dog's name was not listed in the case title, but was mentioned more than any segment in the arguments. Jasper was not a witness, nor could he resist. But his death sparked a chain reaction, forcing the entire state government to admit they were facing a case beyond the control of local police. And the man in the back seat that day, who never shouted, never struck, only held his gaze when cuffed, somehow made the whole system pause, rewrite, and sign off on something no one had dared admit before, that a soldier does not need to wear a uniform to deserve protection. From the Department of Justice headquarters, a brief statement was released via AP, just 5 lines long, but it served as the final conclusion for the whole direction of the event. Malark Allen has been confirmed as an active covert member of Delta Force. Any action against him, direct or indirect, will be considered an act against domestic strategic security. No one mentioned Travis anymore, because from that moment on, the main figure of the story was no longer the trigger puller, but the target, the man who lost a 4-legged comrade but somehow maintained a stance that made an entire nation bow to rewrite the rules on the limits of power and the true meaning of security. Malark Allen declined all interview requests, even from reputable newsrooms known for neutrality and friendliness toward the military. Not because he wanted distance from the media, but because he understood some things only lose meaning when spoken. When his lawyer suggested organizing a press conference, even proposing a closed recording to control content, Malark only looked up, stared straight ahead, then gently shook his head. Later, he wrote a short message in reply. "I don't want to speak. I want the one who killed Jasper to remember his name when biting his lip for the last time in prison. No anger, no hatred." The words simply reflected something deeper than resentment, the choice not to let grief be exploited as entertainment by the media. Malark didn't need TV repeats, didn't need hashtags updated every hour. He only wanted a name remembered in the right place at the right time by the right people. On social media, public opinion began to split. One side stood firm in opposing abuse of power, demanding the prosecution and public trial of Travis Kroll, seeing this as a crucial milestone in redefining the relationship between civilians and law enforcement. The other side, previously skeptical about the military's role in domestic affairs, became more cautious and quieter than usual, not because they changed their stance, but because the clip of Jasper held something no argument could break the dog's eyes before falling. That image, centered, still unblinking, unshaken, silent, made people feel that if they chose the wrong side in this debate, Jasper's silence would become an unanswerable accusation. Many psychological analyses were shared not to criticize, but to better understand why a voiceless creature could make millions feel the weight of silence for the first time. A psychologist wrote in the behavioral frame, "We are used to victims screaming, struggling, begging. But this time what made society stop was a look without resistance. And, perhaps because it came from a creature that cannot tell its story, we are forced to imagine that pain with our own conscience." That comment was quoted repeatedly on radio shows, causing most of the neutral, large but indifferent group to reconsider their place on the moral map. Jasper was no longer just the name of a dog who once served in a war zone, but became an emotional anchor in a story whose main character never cried, never begged, and never did anything but keep his back straight amid chaos. Videos were replayed hundreds of times from different angles, always pausing at the same moment, that look calm, steady, as if silently telling viewers not to stare too long at the victim, but to scrutinize what has become a habit no one dares to call wrong. At a university in Wisconsin, an ethics class dedicated its final session not to law, but to students' emotional reactions after watching the video. A senior student who had previously written essays opposing military intervention stood and said, "I still hold my view on the military, but this time I can't write a single rebuttal, because that dog looked at me through the screen as if I were the one responsible if I chose silence." No one in the class responded, but the professor nodded. He understood. Like most of the country people didn't need more words. Because when an unblinking gaze remains in every frame, those who once hurriedly looked away are now forced to find another way to stand and face it. Not because Jasper is a dog, but because that look made society feel it was being watched. On Monday morning, under the blazing Georgia sun, hundreds lined up outside the federal courthouse while it was still dark. Some wore shirts printed with Jasper's image, others held signs reading "Justice for Jasper," but all remained silent, as if unwilling to break the heavy atmosphere ahead. Inside the main courtroom was fitted with extra seating. Journalists packed every row, cameras all trained on the door where the defendant would enter. When Travis Kroll appeared flanked by 2 federal marshals, no one shouted, but every camera clicked simultaneously, as if everyone waited for the moment he lowered his head, too afraid to look toward the front row where Malark Allen already sat upright, hands resting on his thighs eyes, no lawyer, no paperwork, just a gaze fixed on the bench like a battlefield witness, now seated in a different kind of war. Travis wore a light gray suit, loosely knotted tie, eyes scanning the courtroom before dropping down, lips pressed tight. Beside him was the court-appointed defense attorney, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, seemingly familiar with defending cases of abuse of authority, but this time he spoke little. Perhaps he understood no defense could break the gaze from the photos of Jasper lining the hallway where the dog lifted his head one last time as if still hearing orders. When the trial officially began, the prosecutor stood offering no legal opening or constitutional clause. He scanned the courtroom, then fixed his gaze on Travis' voice, steady but measured. No one expected the death of a dog to make a nation reconsider the gun in a cop's hand. But that dog was not alone, and its eyes did not deserve to be silenced. That statement reframed the whole case. This was no longer a trial of an act. It was a trial of a habit long disguised under the name law enforcement. From the back, someone wiped their eyes. A photographer captured that moment, and the photo later became one of the trial's defining images, for there was no victim or defendant in the frame, only the silence hanging over rows usually filled with heated debate. Millark sat still. He neither nodded nor objected, only kept his gaze as if letting each word in the courtroom pass through him and rebound toward the nameless marches and forgotten places where soldiers return carrying in nothing but memories. Outside, the crowd kept growing. They did not demand a quick verdict. They just wanted to witness the system examine itself once without anyone holding their hand. A 7-year-old child sat on his mother's shoulders holding a colored sign that read, "Jasper was my hero." No one laughed, no one grimaced, because at a time when every pain is politicized, the death of a service animal, silent, loyal, and never reacting beyond limits, became something people had to hear even without a microphone placed in front of its muzzle. The trial continued with the reading of the 3-page indictment, but everyone remembered only one line at the end. This is not a case between a man and a dog. This is a case between authority and consequence. When that was read aloud, Travis barely lifted his head, but he dared not look toward the front row where the man who had kept silent sat, not to be forgiven, but to remind that life, whether two-legged or four-legged, deserves protection by law, not by the feelings of the one holding the gun. Evidence was projected on a large screen in the courtroom, unedited, no special effects, just the original video zoomed in on every detail. The image of Travis drawing his taser without any warning, aiming it straight at Jasper, while it sat quietly, eyes raised, then pulling the trigger as a thoughtless reflex. The sound was not a moan, but a broken, painful howl that made many in the room turn their faces away. Then came Travis's sarcastic remark, clear as day, sitting still like a bench. "Now you're just like one." That line at the moment it was spoken was mere personal arrogance. But when replayed in court in a room full of people who had witnessed and understood the cost of loss, it became a heavy slap against the notion of acting by protocol. Each second of the clip was no longer data. It was a series of cuts through the facade Travis had used to hide contempt and abuse of power beneath his police badge. The prosecutor said little. The projector did its work replaying a death that was never mourned and an attitude that no one spoke up against soon enough. When Hayden Roy stepped up to the witness stand, the courtroom fell so silent you could hear the wind rustling through the curtains behind him. He wore a simple gray shirt. His step hesitated just a moment before facing Millark, whose gaze remained the same calm, neither pushing nor pulling, just waiting. Jaden stood straight, hands on the microphone, his voice steady but low. "I heard the howl, I saw the blood, but what haunts me is his silence, and I realized I was silent the entire year I was a cop. No one spoke after that, perhaps because it was short enough not to need explanation, true enough not to need repetition. Jaden offered no excuses, showed no regret, begging for forgiveness. He simply told what he saw, admitted what he lacked. For a moment, his face blended with dozens outside who watched the clip, commented, shared, but never stepped up to say I was part of that silence. A juror, a retired teacher, leaned forward as if to hear better, though the courtroom microphones had been carefully checked. Maybe because she knew that testimony was a kind of evidence no device could capture, an admission not of a specific mistake, but of the cost of not standing on the right side when there was still a chance. Those in law enforcement in that moment looked at Jaden not as a colleague, but as someone speaking for many who still chose silence to protect their profession. Outside the courthouse, the crowd remained still, watching the live feed on a makeshift big screen, and when the testimony ended, no one applauded. But someone wrote down the exact words handwritten on a sign: I didn't hear the gunfire, but I saw the gaze, and I know I was late. The trial went on, but from that moment, Jaden's role was no longer that of a passive witness. He became the first piece from inside the system to confirm that truth doesn't need more blood to be believed. It just needs someone, no matter how late, to stand up and say, I saw, and this time I won't be silent. Midway through the trial, when all evidence seemed piled on the table, Travis's lawyer stood and spoke in a steady tone as if reading a familiar memo. My client was unaware that the man was military personnel, nor did he know the dog had served on the battlefield. His actions, though regrettable, were not intentionally hostile toward a member of the armed forces. No one in the courtroom nodded. The public outside was not surprised either. They had grown used to the system defending ignorance as if it were immunity. But before the judge could respond, a voice rang out from the front row, not loud, not restrained, but clear as a blade cutting through the frozen air. Malark stood up. It was his first time speaking during the entire trial. He didn't turn to look at Travis, nor at the jury. His eyes fixed on the bench, and each word struck the part of the legal record no one could tear out moral responsibility. You don't need to know where Jasper served. Don't need to know whom he saved, which minefields he crossed, or how he pulled broken soldiers from bombardment. You only need to know you shot something that didn't attack, didn't resist, didn't cry out, but was still shot. Not a cough in the courtroom. No pen continued to write. The man before them didn't speak as a plaintiff, nor like someone seeking personal justice. He spoke as if recording a reckoning for a culture too used to striking first before seeing who it was facing. He paused for a second, then continued, his tone unchanged. I don't ask for a harsh sentence. I don't want him to lose his freedom. I just want him to live with the name Jasper ringing in his head every time he sleeps. I want him to hear that howl, not in his ears, but in his mind. So each time he thinks of pulling the trigger, he must ask himself, why was it so easy? A female juror covered her mouth, eyes glistening, not wiping away tears. The judge leaned forward, hand lightly on the table, not to intervene, but as if anchoring himself in a moment where even law must step back to hear the named morality. Malarka returned to his seat. He did not bow his head, said nothing more. And from that moment, the whole trial shifted axis. No one called Travis by title anymore. No one mentioned his military record. The focus was no longer on roles, but on actions. The name Jasper, just a dog's name, had now become the beat that measured every question society hadn't dared to answer. Why must victims have credentials to be protected? Why must death by a gunshot cause a reaction? Why does a steady gaze shake the system more than a 100-page indictment? A reporter transcribed Malark's entire statement verbatim without edits or commentary. The article was shared millions of times, not because of the writing style, but because of the voice itself, spoken without a microphone, without emotion, without anger. People shared it not for satisfaction, but to remind each other that some names, when killed, don't die twice. Because each time that name is spoken, it cuts deeper into society's consciousness. And Travis, no matter the verdict, would live with a name that needs no tombstone inscription but is etched deeper than end sentence. A name in the exact sense Malark said is a cut. not healed, not fated, not forgiven. When Malark finished his last words, no one in the courtroom dared to breathe heavily, his gaze fixed on an undefined point, as if his words weren't aimed at any individual but targeted a culture seemingly formless, yet always existing beneath layers of power, using silence as a shield. In the few seconds after he sat down, everything in the room seemed frozen. A juror, a woman in her 50s, clutching the trial summary, instinctively wiped tears from her cheek, not from fleeting emotion, but because she felt something inside her unravel in a part of reason that once believed justice could be measured by punishments and files. The entire courtroom fell silent. No murmurs from the press. No one raised a phone to record. In that moment, no camera was needed to remember, because what happened was engraved directly into the consciousness of everyone present. Travis bowed his head, fists clenched on his thighs, his face no longer defiant, but filled with the emptiness of someone who realized all familiar escapes could not shield him from the gaze of a name killed without a voice. Outside, hundreds stood watching the live feed. When Malark's words appeared as subtitles, someone captured and posted them on social media with a single caption, "Jasper rings in his head every time he sleeps." Just that line alone was shared more than 700,000 times in 3 hours without the video. In the comments, users began changing hashtags from #Justice4. Jasper, the online movement shifted to a new symbol, say his name even if he barked. The phrase, seeming somewhat ironic, revealed a deep injustice. Why are only names that speak, write, and scream in court remembered? Why must a loyal dog who pulled people from minefields wait until its unjust death for society to mention it in a way equal to the humans it risked its life to protect? The new hashtag quickly became a topic of debate across many platforms. Some voiced opposition, arguing that calling a dog by name like a person was an unnecessary equivalence. But most understood clearly that what was being named was not a specific creature, but the way the system chooses to respond to pain, only listening when it's human enough or loud enough to cause a stir. This time, however, a voiceless creature taught the entire community that silence has its own sound loud enough to force those who ignored it to bow and rewrite the definition of the value of life. A freelance writer posted on a personal blog, "His name doesn't need to be carved on a tombstone. It only needs to be heard howling from the space between right and wrong every time someone sleeps." And that is a sentence the perpetrator can never appeal. That line was quoted no less than 10 times in evening news reports, not because of the words themselves, but because it spoke to what people felt. Jasper's silence was not an end, but a beginning of a new sound, a calling from mouths that had never been heard. And every time someone rewrites that hashtag, they rewrite the very definition of justice that the system once forgot behind the dog lying quietly on the sidewalk on a sunny Sunday morning, a symbol that can no longer be denied. On sentencing day, the courtroom was less crowded than before, but silence still filled every wooden bench, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting not for a verdict, but for closure to a chain of events no one dared believe they had truly lived through. Travis Kroll entered wearing a light gray suit, collar, wrinkled face, void of any clear expression, no longer bearing the careless confidence of earlier days. He walked alone. No family, no colleagues, no one to represent the defense stood by him. The entire system that once revolved around him now quietly withdrew, leaving a solitary figure, just as he had isolated himself through decisions he once thought were mere procedural duties. Before pronouncing the sentence, the judge scanned the room, not looking at Travis or at Malark, who remained seated in the front row, upright, expressionless, as if witnessing a ritual rather than awaiting recognition. The judge's voice rang out steady but firm, like a final stroke drawn beneath a trial long stripped of personal meaning. Every bullet, every shock, every police act is not harmless. They cast a shadow, sometimes not on the street, but over the trust of a nation. No applause, no outcry, because those words left no room for reaction other than the acceptance that though the verdict is legal in form, what is truly judged today is the ethical limit of power. The sentence was read briefly. Travis Kroll was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison, permanently stripped of law enforcement authority, barred from access to any armed domestic administrative system or coercive power. No civil compensation was demanded, as Malark did not file a claim. He had never demanded anything, nor expected to receive anything. Yet, because of that, the sentence carried even heavier weight morally. It did not come from settlement or compromise, but from a chain of inexcusable wrong choices. Jaden Roy was called next. He stepped up, met no one's gaze with avoidance, nor bowed his head. When the judge read his sentence, a 1-year suspended sentence for failing to intervene when able to stop wrongdoing, he simply nodded, offering no objection or excuse. Immediately after the trial, he voluntarily submitted his resignation from the force, though no one asked him to. This act was neither political nor a gesture of atonement. It was simply a way of saying some truths once fully seen can no longer be ignored. Jaden withdrew not to evade, but to allow others to see that the system can change from within if someone dares to stop before it's too late. When the decisions were announced, the media did not flood in as usual. Instead, a strange silence stretched for 20 seconds before the judge struck the gavel. No one stood up immediately. Everyone remained seated as if waiting for something, not in the ritual, a voice, a sigh, or simply the feeling that justice this time had not passed by, even if late. Then, as Malark stood and walked straight out the door without looking back, those in the courtroom began to leave, not in order, not hurried, but carrying something heavier than any document signed that morning, the fragile belief that the law sometimes still bows to losses no one can accuse. Malark did not sit through to the end. When Jaden's sentence was read, he quietly rose, refusing to meet any eyes. He left through a side hallway, his shoes silent, yet each step seemed to carry the full weight of what wasn't written in files, wasn't part of the verdict, and couldn't be wrapped up by the word justice. Outside, sunlight slanted onto the sidewalk lined with old bricks. Uneven rays crossed his shoulder as he paused near an intersection. The breeze was gentle, just enough to stir the wisps of hair at his temple, dry and still, as if understanding that some farewells need no tears. He didn't look back at the courthouse or the police cars parked along the curb, only watched the passing crowd like scattered puzzle pieces, each carrying their own part of the world, unaware that today something had quietly closed inside those cold gray brick walls. A boy, about 8 years old, wearing a red t-shirt and worn sneakers, ran across the sidewalk from the park. He stopped when he saw Malark's face, not because he recognized him, but something in the man's stance made him pause. The boy looked up, eyes wide with curiosity, and an instinct to ask something he couldn't hold back. "Are you a soldier?" he asked in a soft voice, as if afraid to disturb, yet standing straight with both hands clutching his backpack straps like a recruit who had never been to war. Malark looked at him for a few seconds, then nodded gently. "I used to be a soldier, but today I'm just someone who lost a friend." The reply carried no sorrow, no exaggeration. It was as straightforward as the campaign reports he once wrote, short, clear, leaving no room for interpretation. The boy didn't ask anything else. He nodded, turned away, but before stepping forward, his hand lightly touched Malark's sleeve. A silent, nameless thank you. Malark watched the small figure run back to his mother standing beneath a tree, then turned his face toward the street ahead where life continued as usual. There were car horns, voices from a cafe across the road, the hurried tapping of shoes belonging to someone late for work. Yet, amidst all those sounds, there seemed to be a silence nestled between two breaths. No one noticed it, but for Malark, it was clearer than any verdict ever read in the courtroom behind him. That silence was what Jasper left behind, not because he died, but because his life forced a society to stop, look at itself, and ask how many more deaths would be deemed accidental. Malark didn't leave immediately. He still stood there on the sidewalk, not waiting for anyone or avoiding anyone, but because a part of him was still holding on to that last howl fading from memory, a sound he knew would never truly disappear. Jasper would not return, and justice, though served, could not be undone. But if every step he took from now on carried a glance from children like the boy just now, then maybe Jasper hadn't truly vanished. He still lived, not in his barley-colored fur, but in every moment someone stops, asks the right questions, and doesn't rush to forget the answers. And so standing at the edge of the sidewalk while the courthouse faded behind him like a shadow, Malark was no soldier, no witness, no victor. He was just a man who had lost a dog, and because of that, made an entire society find a way to name what's right. The military cemetery this morning was quieter than usual. Rows of headstones stood in neat lines like the spine of a memory that never sighed, held together only by duty and death. A light breeze brushed the grass, not strong enough to stir dry leaves, but enough to send a chill down one's neck as if the breath of those who fell long ago still lingered. A new stone has just been placed. No military name or rank insignia, no K9 title, and certainly not marked as a pet. On the stone were only 6 capitalized words deeply etched without embellishment. Jasper walked beside a ghost who needed no gun to make a nation listen. No flowers, no portrait, no memorial speech. Yet someone stood before it silent and long as if holding time still. Malark Allen was not in uniform, wore no medals, and had no company. He came from the far end of the cemetery, each step measured neither fast nor slow. His right hand was in his coat pocket, his left held a neatly folded scarf still creased from a combat backpack. He stopped at the stone, bowed slightly, as a soldier does after surviving shelling, then placed the scarf carefully beneath it. No one spoke. No one else was there to break the quiet that Jasper deserved. Malark stood long, staring at the deeply carved words as if rereading the name of an old comrade. His eyes were dry, his face unmoved, but one hand rose gently touching the cold stone as if checking for a last breath left in a soul no longer present. He whispered not to anyone, "Keep sleeping. There's no one left here who needs you to save them." His hand stayed there for several seconds, then fell, as if confirming Jasper's watch over the rest of the war had ended. No more shelling, no more knights armed, no orders to move, no radio calls in the dark. Only grass stone, and that name Jasper, written like a rest in a melody no commander wanted to spell out. Some deaths are honored with funerals, flags draped over coffins, and 3 volleys of rifle fire before burial. But Jasper needed none of that. He only needed someone to stand before him in silence. Someone who had lived, fought lost friends, and now knew that peace doesn't come from farewell salutes, but from the final words that stop a nation and make it listen. Jasper never howled again after the shot, yet shook the system as if that howl never ceased. Since then, in every discussion, every police training session, every ethics manual on duty enforcement, no one can talk about the right to shoot without being haunted by the gaze of that dog, calm, fearless, as if fully understanding what it was dying for. When Malark turned his back and left, he did not look back, did not check if anyone was watching or hoped for anyone to film or post, because what needed to be remembered was already set in stone, and what Jasper left behind needed no sharing, no editing, no framing. It only needed to be read once enough so those who left would no longer walk the same path as before. Across the green grass, the wind passed again unhurried, perhaps because that place was now peaceful enough for a friend who once lived quietly, died tragically, and was called by a name with respect few ever received. Jasper, without badge or title, still made a nation look up. No funeral was held, no wreaths, no black-draped seats, no speeches or somber music from speakers. Jasper was laid among those who once wore badges and were called heroes, needing no ceremony to be counted as equal. The press was absent. No channel covered the story. But as Malark stepped out of the cemetery grounds, the guard at the gate stood at attention, hand touching his hat brim, in salute to a senior officer, though Jasper never held rank or military ID. It wasn't a commanded gesture, but the reflex of someone who understood that some deaths, even outside the ranks, are enough to make a system bow. Malark responded with a slight nod. Neither spoke, but the silence between them carried more weight than any oath, as if the living and the keeper of sacred ground silently understood they had just bid farewell to a warrior not in uniform, unarmed yet, who accomplished what no advisory board ever imagined, making a nation stop judging by color and begin to learn to see with bare eyes. The sun began to pour light over the headstones, sparkling but gentle, as if nature itself tried to preserve a measure of peace for a land that buried more than anyone dared count. After a few steps, Malark stopped, noticing something small shining beneath a tree near the path. It was a folded piece of paper placed under a round stone, like a message left in a barracks without an envelope. He bent down and opened it. The handwriting was messy, slanted, probably hurried, but every word was charged with true emotion. "I don't know if my name still means anything, but I will teach my puppy to remember yours. No signature, no date, no clue to identify. Just a scrap of paper, but for Malark, heavier than any metal, because it showed Jasper was recognized not just by law or hashtags, but by a promise passed down from an unknown person to a generation yet to speak, but who will learn to recognize loyalty unhealed wounds and what must never be repeated. He folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket. His eyes were dry, but inside he felt a tightening, as if a wire had just been connected somewhere between Jasper and a soul not yet old enough to understand the world's cruelty, but soon enough to know what to fear. For a brief moment, Malark imagined a small fluffy dog sitting beside a boy learning to speak, and the first name it learned wasn't its own, but Jasper. He knew he would never meet the person who left that note, but he didn't need to, because the deepest promises require no witnesses. And from today, Jasper was no longer a name buried with death. It had become a word, a living symbol, a story told without editing, strong enough to stand alone among hundreds of names already layered with too many words. The wind blew across his shoulder again. Malark walked on this time without looking back. In his pocket, the small paper still held a faint warmth, as if it were unfinished. But precisely because it was incomplete, it left space for those who came after to continue writing, each with a sentence, a glance, a decision not to pull the trigger. And perhaps that is what Jasper truly left behind, a chain of silent ongoing acts, unannounced, unorganized, yet enough so that from now on forgotten names will be taught again, one sentence, one generation at a time. In a windless classroom on the third floor of the State Police Academy, the projector's light reflected onto a white screen, a haunting image that once shook society. Jasper, lying motionless on the grass, two legs curled as if still trying to shield his owner on the brink of life and death, while Malark sat handcuffed on the sidewalk, head slightly raised, eyes fixed on the patrol car's rearview mirror. In the silent room, as if caught between heartbeats, 30 cadets sat upright, eyes locked on the screen. No one laughed, no one frowned. The clip had no soundtrack, no cuts, no exaggerations, just a raw timeline capturing the moment a dog was shocked, a man remained silent, and a system began to crack. A young cadet in a fresh uniform spoke with a slight tremor, but no hesitation. "Is that, really, Delta Force?" He wasn't seeking confirmation, but searching for words from someone with authority to affirm he wasn't imagining an absurd image that forced a relearning of how to judge a person. The instructor, standing by the board, salt and pepper hair, and still holding the remote, nodded softly, but didn't say yes. Instead, he answered in a deep, firm voice. More precisely, it's a person who doesn't need to prove power, only to hold a stance. That response seemed to pull the class out of theoretical orbit and thrust them into a reality where nothing runs on written law, but on the sense between people, where whoever holds the stance survives, and whoever loses it has nothing left to cling to even while holding a gun. No one asked to stop the video, but everyone knew there was no need to watch at all, because the lesson wasn't in the ending. It was in the moment. Malark looked into the mirror, not to identify anyone, but to make those behind him look at themselves. The instructor didn't lecture long. He said nothing about process or procedure. Instead, he showed another slide containing Malark's rare post-incident interview quote, "I'm not there to prove who I am. I'm only there to prove there's still someone who won't trade dignity to survive." Beneath the quote was a photo of the white stone where Jasper was buried. The inscription sunk like a period, closing a chapter of history no one was proud of, but no one was allowed to forget. A female cadet in the back row took a pen and slowly wrote in the margin, "Holding a stance isn't to resist. It's to avoid being swallowed by wrong." Those words were not meant to be submitted or tested, but acted like a necessary pause, reminding the whole class that today they were not just learning how to act, but being reminded that sometimes the only thing needed is not to retreat, not to resist, but to let the other side understand that behind you lies something they cannot buy with power or medals. Before dismissing the class, the instructor said, "You'll go out on the streets with guns and badges, but what keeps you standing isn't those two things. It's something everyone can see, but no one issues character." Then he turned off the projector, leaving the screen blank like an unwritten page. The cadets left one by one without noise, maybe because everyone understood today's lesson wasn't meant to be remembered, but to be lived. And from now on, every time someone is stopped for suspicion, the look from the person ahead will recall a clip that once made the whole country pause judgment by uniform and start questioning who truly holds their ground and who clings to their position to forget when they lost their character. On the final exam of the civic skills class for new officers, the first question on the screen was unlike any test the Academy had ever designed. There were no multiple choice options, no true or false. Only one sentence appeared in bold, even letters across the blank screen. If you had stood beside Travis that day, what would you have done? But what silenced the class wasn't the question itself, it was the instruction that followed answer, with a moment of silence, no words, only attitude. No one laughed, no one asked for clarification. Some put their pens down. Some stretched as if rebalancing their own posture in the chair. And in that moment, the final exam became a mirror, reflecting humanity not based on scores, but on how someone chooses to respond when confronted with wrongdoing happening right before their eyes. A cadet sitting in the second row from the back was the only one not looking at the board. He closed his notebook, placed his hands on his thighs, and stared toward the window frame, where light filtered through the blinds in thin slashes like a surgeon's cut. No one knew what he was thinking, but the instructor saw a shift in his posture. Shoulders no longer tense, head tilted slightly, eyes not tracking anything specific but seemingly focused on a silent space never taught in textbooks. He didn't need to write nor perform. Perhaps he understood that silence was not absence of action, but the full presence of a principle that doesn't shout slogans or need orders, but when standing beside someone stepping away from the standard forces you either to step out or cease to be yourself. Years later, that same cadet became a patrol officer in the city center, holding a modest rank and earning a modest salary, yet never once had a citizen complained about his conduct. During what seemed like a routine shift, he and a colleague were dispatched to a report of a homeless man with a dog causing causing a traffic obstruction. When they arrived, the dog was lying down, neither barking nor growling, only lifting its head to watch its owner trying to gather old blankets spilling onto the sidewalk. His colleague immediately drew his weapon, muttering something about attack risk. But before raising the trigger, the officer stepped forward, placed his hand on the gun grip, gently pushed it down, and said, "It's lying down. It's alive. No shouting, no tension yet." His eyes carried the same look Malark had years ago, not waiting for permission nor needing understanding, simply refusing to allow wrongdoing while standing there. That incident never made the news. The homeless man that day didn't know who had saved him from a repeated tragedy. But in the internal report, the shift supervisor wrote a brief note, intervened to prevent unnecessary use of force through attitude. That note was the clearest answer to the test, from years before a test without a set answer, but repeated daily under thousands of uniforms nationwide. Each time, someone chooses not to pull the trigger, not out of fear, but because they understand the value of standing tall at the right moment. Jasper lives again, not through flesh and blood, but through the actions of those who heard his name and refused to let it fade away again. This year's memorial service took place in a small church with dark wooden shingles tucked behind a row of pines on the northern edge of town. The crowd wasn't large, but every pew was filled with faces who once wore helmets, carried guns, and walked through unnamed lands. Wreaths lined both sides of the aisle, not following military protocol, but brought personally by locals, wildflowers, white daisies, and dried lavender branches, tokens of remembrance given without conditions. The name reader stood behind a worn wooden podium, his voice steady and paced slowly, calling out each name as if unraveling strands of memory suspended from the church's high ceiling. The list was long, each name answered by a small chime from a handbell resting nearby. When the last name was called, the reader paused, scanning the room as if ready to close the ceremony. But before he could speak, an elderly hand rose from the back row, slow but firm. The woman, over 80, silver-haired, wearing a beige coat and leaning on a cane, rose and walked down the aisle. Silence fell. No one knew who she was, and no one stopped her. Her measured steps bore the certainty of age that made everyone step back. She reached the podium, no microphone needed, and with trembling hands unfolded a small yellowed piece of paper creased from being kept in a pocket too long. She read, slowly, voice soft but clear enough to silence the room Jasper. No rank, no pay, but once shielded bullets like an instinct needing no orders. No one spoke, no applause followed, yet the space itself seemed to hold its breath. The old name reader bowed his head gently, nodded once, then breaking protocol rang the bell again. The chime sounded a note not on the official list, but no one objected. This time it wasn't for a soldier's ID, but for a being who lived as a comrade. No rank, no formal training, just loyal instinct and eyes that waited for orders even when humans hesitated. The woman placed the paper on the edge of the podium, nodded once, and returned to her seat. No questions were asked. Everyone understood that speech needed neither length nor explanation. It was simply an addition for an omission even the official roster lacked the subtlety to acknowledge. In the quiet space, after the ceremony ended, some lingered by the small piece of paper, staring at the name, Jasper, written in faded ink, but the line below remained as clear as if just penned. A young soldier stood there for a long moment before pulling out his phone not to take a picture but to type that very name into the search bar. Not to verify, but to relearn how to properly write a word once deemed unworthy of remembering. From that day forward, at every memorial service held in that church, an unofficial bell toll was always added dedicated to the name that once shielded bullets lay silently beneath the grass, needed no honors but still commanded the room's silence. Jasper, a name without medals yet, leaving more behind than any chest full of decorations ever could. No one inside the church objected. The officiant, after a few seconds of thoughtful silence as if weighing something beyond routine, nodded gently. He picked up the list again, marked just below the last soldier's name, and wrote one more word. Jasper. It was neither bolded, underlined, nor marked in any special way, but its presence made the list feel complete for the first time after years of recitation. No discussion followed because everyone understood that the name was not added for glory. It was added so it would not be forgotten. And in a world where most lost lives fade into silence after a day of headlines, having a name rewritten by strangers and remembered by those who never met him was the clearest affirmation that Jasper's presence was never temporary. After the service in the stone-paved courtyard behind the church, someone approached the elderly woman and asked if she knew Jasper, if she had ever met his owner, or if she only heard stories. She smiled softly, sat down on a bench under a tree's shade, hands clasped, eyes distant as if speaking of something beyond familiarity. Her voice was steady but quiet. "I never met him, but I've never seen anyone die who made others stay silent for so long." Those words left no room for further questions. How could anyone argue against a death that stopped a nation, force the police to reconsider their procedures? Changed officer training curricula sparked weekly debates between lawyers and citizens, yet remains unresolved. How could one deny the impact of a creature whose steady gaze alone compelled justice to speak, even if late and slow? No one knew the elderly woman's name, yet she was remembered in the ceremonies that followed as the first to dare speak Jasper's name in a place where no one was sure it truly belonged. From then on, that name no longer lived only in the heart of its owner or within news articles. It began to appear in speeches, tagged in new campaigns on law enforcement ethics, etched onto a small corner of memorial walls, honoring unofficially served lives. Jasper became the symbol of what every system feared to face: the consequences of an unjustified death, a decision marked by power but lacking dignity. And in later classes or seminars, when people spoke of the limits of coercive authority, Jasper's name came up not as an icon, but as a mirror reflecting the truth that the silent are not always weak, and those without titles still leave their marks. Somewhere, many years later, when new officers were asked about the lesson that made them hesitate before pulling the trigger, they would not mention any law test or technical rule. They would speak of Jasper's steady gaze, the death that silenced a whole society, and the whispered words of an unknown elderly woman. Just one time, writing a name correctly is enough to right the wrongs of a whole generation. From then on, Jasper wouldn't need to be remembered for being a dog or for where it served. It would be remembered as the only name ever added by a community to a closed list, reminding everyone that no one should be left behind for being a different species or for dying in silence. Because sometimes the deepest silence comes from deaths that make the whole world stop speaking. The A1 Hall at the State Law University was packed, bright white lights from the ceiling shining down on perfectly aligned rows of seats where senior students, trainee lawyers, and seasoned professors sat silently before the main stage. This year's annual Law Enforcement Reform Forum featured a rarely covered topic in official curricula: limits of enforcement power. On stage stood a former federal judge who had overseen many sensitive cases involving law enforcement misconduct. With gray hair and a simple suit, his voice was not loud but carried enough resonance that no one dared interrupt. A young student in the middle row stood up. His tone was not confrontational but reflected the natural doubt of someone beginning to face reality. He asked, "Can we change an entire system, change the law, change the culture of enforcement, just because a dog was killed?" The question rang out low and clear, causing some behind to lean forward in anticipation. For a moment, the room fell silent as everyone knew the question wasn't really about the dog, but about the boundary of a society full of reasons to avoid the truth. The speaker didn't answer immediately. He lifted his glass, took a sip, then set it down. Without looking at the questionnaire, he fixed his gaze on the back rows and said, "No, not because of the dog. dog. His calm voice struck listeners deeply, making them sit straighter, because for the first time, people no longer had an excuse. No gray areas left. No might have had a weapon, might have acted threatening, might have refused to comply. Just a creature lying still and killed. He paused, letting the words settle across the room, and that death, because no one could argue it away, forced everyone to listen. The entire audience was silent. No one objected. That very no objection was proof that change was beginning. A death that needed no debate, no secondary evidence, no dramatic conclusion. A creature that did not speak, resist, or know how to protect itself, yet did something the legal community had never done strongly enough, made silence carry weight. The speaker continued, his voice deeper. That event not only made us reconsider the use of force, but forced us to rethink the definition of fear. How many have been killed for being possibly dangerous? But that dog was not a threat. So why was it killed, and why only after its death did we dare start asking who should really fear whom? Another student wrote in his notebook, "From a dog we are forced to become human." Those words didn't need to be spoken aloud, but they began to appear more frequently in later discussions. No one referred to Jasper merely as a victim anymore. It became a turning point, not because of its death, but because it died at a time when society could no longer hide. One single moment with no ifs, no buts, no exceptions. Only wrongdoing and consequences that cannot be blurred. The speaker concluded succinctly, "I have presided over many trials. Victims can speak, argue, tremble, but Jasper could not. And it's that absolute silence that leaves us no choice but to hear the voice of conscience, one we used to silence just to get by." Then he left the stage. The room remained quiet, but within that silence, many began for the first time to ask, maybe the greatest things actually start from the smallest things we once walked past unnoticed, from a dog, from an electric shock, from a steady gaze, and from that, no one walks away the same. The final slide of the talk at the law school auditorium showed no charts, no capitalized slogans typical of reform seminars. It was just a photo untitled with no caption telling viewers how to feel. The image showed Jasper, curled up, seemingly holding on to his last warmth amid sun-spotted grass. Next to him was Malark, kneeling, head slightly bowed, one hand resting on the dog's chest, the other on the ground as if to keep himself from collapsing. His face was not clear, but the curve of his shoulders, the tension in his neck, the way his chest lightly touched Jasper's back, all conveyed something words shouldn't describe. No one stood up or signaled to do so. But as the auditorium's lights slowly dimmed, to highlight the photo, the front row rose first. Those behind followed not out of courtesy, but because of a shared inexplicable feeling to remain seated would be to feel beneath one's own conscience. No applause, no gasps. Nearly 200 people stood silently, eyes fixed on the screen where life once existed in the form of a creature that could not speak and was now honored in the quietest yet most complete way. In that moment there was no law, no speaker role, no degree or title. There was only shared empathy, a primal human reflex to an inexplicable loss. A man kneeling beside his dog, a gesture absent from any civics lesson, not found in any statute or clause. It's something undefinable but instantly recognized when seen. And from that gaze, each person suddenly felt small, not from ignorance, but because for the first time they realized some lessons can only be learned by standing still and holding silence. Near the back row, a student put pen to notebook, not to take notes, but to write a single line. Be human first, then learn to do right. He didn't plan to turn it in or quote it in later discussions. He simply wanted to keep it like preserving a handwritten passage in an old book, not to show off, but to reread when needing a reminder that he still had a heart. The photo remained on the screen, no curtain falling, no scene changing. But everyone understood the talk had ended with something unsaid, and precisely because it was unsaid, it echoed louder than any practice practiced speech. When the lights came back on, the atmosphere didn't immediately return to normal. The shuffling of chairs, the soft footsteps down the aisle were all held back as if afraid to blur the moment that just passed. At the exit, the organizers didn't hand out papers or say thanks. They simply stood quietly, nodding lightly to each person leaving, as if making a silent promise from now on everyone stepping out these doors carried that image. And the responsibility to keep it alive wasn't written in law, but in every small choice made when power is in your hands. A dog, a soldier, a moment without slogans, and a community beginning to learn how to stand tall through their own eyes. 5 years later, in a city absent from the news. Back then, the afternoon sky darkened behind rows of trees lining West Avenue. A patrol car rolled slowly along the sidewalk, its lights blinking rhythmically, no sirens, no warnings. The young officer in the driver's seat noticed a scene often classified as preventive. A black man standing near a park, walking a large dog without a muzzle or leash, strolling lazily across a sunset-lit lawn. His hand instinctively touched his holster, a reflex drilled into him during dozens of training hours, stressing better safe than sorry. But then he stopped, not because anyone ordered him to, not because a colleague was nearby. He stopped because in that brief hesitation, something arose, shapeless, unspoken. Just a feeling he knew well of the consequences if his hand moved any further. He exhaled without opening the door. The man stood about 15 feet away. He neither approached nor retreated, didn't speak, didn't challenge. Just stood, steady, on the paved ground, a light breeze lifting the edge of his gray coat, and his hand rested gently on the dog's head, not holding, just resting. That soft touch triggered the young officer's memory of an old photo shown in training 4 years ago, a man kneeling hand on the chest of a quiet dog. No words, no slogans, just a gaze so powerful it made the whole room stand. In that moment, the officer realized he wasn't facing just a man walking a dog, but the choice between habit and awareness. He could follow protocol, ask for permits, justify it as community protection, but he didn't raise his hand. Instead, he rolled down the car window slightly, a non-threatening gesture, and looked at the man not with suspicion but as a silent message that he knew on the other side of that gaze was a human, and beside him a creature that bore part of humanity's silent society he refused to face. The man nodded silently, then bent down, lightly patted the dog's back as a sign of departure. The dog glanced back, didn't bark. The officer stayed seated, made no report, marked no incident. He just watched through the rearview mirror as the man walked away. That image didn't worry him. It reminded him of a final lesson from training. Sometimes doing nothing is the bravest act of the day. That second look caused no harm, no death, but it saved a piece of faith in the lessons taught but rarely truly lived. As he started the car to continue his shift, he noticed his palm still felt slightly tense like the first time he learned to grip a gun, but this time it was learning to let go. No one recorded that action. No medal was awarded, but he knew he had just added a small chapter to Jasper's story, not with words, but with a quiet, timely decision. Because system change sometimes begins not with reform, but with a young person willing to look carefully just one more time before acting. And that second look, silent as it was, became the first step to maintaining integrity in a world that constantly demands reaction. The officer released his grip on the holster, nodded gently, as if closing a door that didn't need opening. "Nice morning, kid," he said, without sternness or control. Then he drove off. No notes, no report, no case, number logged. The car rolled along the grass-edged wheels, passing through mottled sunlight, leaving behind a man with a dog who stood still, hand resting on the animal's head as if nothing unusual had happened. But that nothing was the day's most significant moment. It showed that some silences aren't avoidance, but deliberate choices, not wielding power, not imposing fear, but simply acknowledging each other's presence as equals. Inside the patrol car, beside the rearview rearview mirror lay a crumpled, frayed brownish piece of paper stained with sweat and time. It wasn't an internal memo legal excerpt or official order, just a handwritten line rough but deeper than any slogan posted in the training room. Don't let Jasper die again. The young officer first read that in a second-year forum where someone held up a photo of a man kneeling beside a lying dog softly saying, "No need to understand deeply. Just don't let it happen again." He didn't remember who gave him the paper, nor who wrote the phrase, but since taping that note to the mirror, he never removed it, not to remember the dog, but to not forget himself in moments he might otherwise forget. Every morning before leaving, he looked into the mirror and saw that line reflected in his eyes, a reminder that some trigger pulls don't make noise but kill things irreparably if done without care. Jasper, though absent, was present in every small decision, every muted siren, every lowered window to look closer before reaching for the holster. The officer never told this story to anyone, didn't post online about how he did the right thing, didn't seek praise, because sometimes doing right means doing something good without feeling the need to say so. The road stretched on the scenery unchanged, but the people in the car had traveled a different distance, not measured in miles, but in the space between a restrained impulse and a consequence avoided. And that pause, quiet and unremarkable, saved more than one life. It preserved a moment in society from becoming just another copy of what once sparked outrage, then was forgotten. Because a death recalled is not to honor the victim, but to teach the living how not to lose anyone else to needless reasons. As the car turned onto the next street, the crumpled note fluttered slightly in the breeze from the dashboard air vent. The writing had faded somewhat, but remained legible. No one but him noticed it, yet he at that very moment had lived up to its message. Don't let Jasper die again. And today, with the seemingly ordinary phrase and a non-judgmental glance, he kept that promise. No one acknowledged it. No one bore witness. But sometimes that alone is enough to keep history from repeating and to prevent a name from being buried again. The mountain road led to a wooden house with no nameplate, no fence, and no security cameras. It nestled quietly among pine trees, far from the highway where GPS sometimes showed a question mark instead of directions. The independent reporter had spent nearly 2 weeks tracking down the coordinates, piecing together leaked tips, unlabeled old photos, and rumors most people doubted. But when he stepped onto the weathered porch, the scent of pine mixed with black coffee drifting from inside confirmed he had found the right person. Malark didn't come out to greet him. The door creaked open as if on cue, and his voice echoed from within. "Come in." "But I'm not answering every question." The reporter stepped inside, set down his recorder, and didn't turn on his camera. He knew some conversations should exist only in memory. The house was neat and orderly, like a miniature military unit, but not cold. A small fire burned low in the stove. A few books lay scattered, and by the window sat a rough fabric dog bed where a small gray dog named Milo curled up guarding a dream. When asked about the dog, Malark didn't introduce him, but pointed and said, "He's not a replacement for Jasper. It's just I can't drink coffee," in complete silence. The reporter didn't press further. He knew the story had been told countless times in the press online classrooms and conferences. He asked only one question. "What do you see when you look back at that trial?" Malark was silent for a moment, eyes fixed on the window where the breeze stirred the curtains. "I don't need to say more," his voice calm and soft like the way he had walked through tension society expected to ignite screams. "They already understand. Anything more I say could ruin the silence that's been built." The reporter nodded slightly, realizing this interview wasn't for more quote, but to confirm the existence of a man who chose to stay behind all the applause. No legend plaque hung on the wall, no framed medals, no evidence proving this was the home of someone who forced the Department of Defense to intervene and the justice system to revise law enforcement ethics. Malark lived like an ordinary man, waking to the smell smell of coffee, walking his dog on the hillside, reading old books, and occasionally responding to letters from students by printing handwritten replies and slipping them into unaddressed envelopes. He never called himself a hero, nor allowed anyone in the town to call him that. I did what needed to be done. Heroes are those who choose not to use guns when they could. When the reporter stood to say goodbye, Malark didn't shake his hand. He simply nodded, then turned back to the kitchen to brew a fresh pot of coffee. Milo remained asleep. The wind still blew. Outside, the world kept searching for symbols to name justice. But here, in this small, unnamed wooden house, the man who made the whole system pause and reflect lived on as a reminder that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is to stay silent after justice has spoken for them. Not out of fear, but out of faith. Faith that once is enough if people choose to remember. Malark stood silently for a few seconds, the light from the porch casting half his face in shadow, deepening the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes like the carved marks of years spent choosing silence so others could speak. He didn't answer immediately, just gazed toward the forest, where the wind rustled pine branches in a steady rhythm like a deep breath. Then he turned back, voice low, but weighted like a stone, dropped on still water. Learn to stop before pulling the trigger, before asking the name, even before thinking you have the right to. The reporter nodded, but neither wrote nor pressed record. He knew some words are meant to live in the listener's memory, not to be displayed publicly, and for that reason they last longer. As he stepped down the worn wooden steps onto the forest path, a soft breeze blew in through the window, stirring an old newspaper on the table and lifting dust from a small item tucked at the table's edge, a frayed patch of moss green, faded with a barely visible inscription that required tilting one's head to read DFC 11. Malark didn't explain, didn't hang it on the wall or place it in a display case. It rested there unguarded and undecorated like the quietest part of the house and perhaps the quietest part of himself. According to some accounts, that patch once marked identification on a mission never officially recorded where the name Jasper was first spoken amid flames, smoke, and gunfire that blurred commands and reflexes alike. It's a memory no one asked about, and Malark never recounted, not to hide, but because he knew some things lose their value when turned into stories retold. It lay there on the stained wooden table beside an unfinished notebook and a dried-out pen, untouched, unstraightened, like memories themselves distorted, worn, but impossible to erase. The reporter didn't ask permission to take photos, nor did he ask any more questions. He just looked one last time, then walked down the dirt road where his car waited, the window still open to let the forest breeze in. When he turned back, the wooden house was hidden behind the pines as if it had never existed on the map. But the words, "learn to stop," stuck with him, echoing in the silence of the engine, starting blending with the radio news about another dispute between civilians and police. He turned off the radio, sat still, and wrote the first line of an article that didn't mention heroes, didn't build legends, didn't express emotion. It was just a lesson from a man who never claimed to be anything special, but who preserved what society nearly lost the ability to recognize its own limits at the right time. And in that meadowless house, the truth was kept not to remind others, but so he could look back every day without losing his way. The museum sits atop a low hill on the city's outskirts, modest in size and architecture, yet it always draws visitors. They aren't typical tourists. No tour groups, no children running, no selfie lines at the entrance, just people walking slowly, eyes cast sideways, with a quiet reverence spreading silently through the halls. This place is called the Hall of Quiet Resistance, built to honor those who shifted society through silent actions without noise weapons or confrontation, only with unbreakable resolve. At the far end of the East Corridor lies a small, humble space among exhibits on anti-war movements movements, civil rights protests, and famous lawsuits. No one directs visitors here yet, everyone finds it. A small plaque outside reads, "Animals that changed laws." In this few square foot space, there are no statues, no LED screens replaying images, and no glass cases with relics. Centered on a rough oak board hangs a small bronze plaque, palm-sized engraved, simply with 3 lines, neat and unembellished: Jasper Dog. Veteran, witness. Nothing more is needed. No biography, no recounting of deeds, no story. But this restraint causes visitors to stand longer in silence. A name that never spoke, a creature that never argued or defended, now placed in a hall dedicated to the most powerful acts that required no words. Beside the plaque, a small device plays a sound every 3 minutes. No narration, no commentary, just a 4-second audio clip taken from the original viral video that spread across social media years ago. A short, choked, broken howl. Jasper's last sound before fading away. Each time the howl plays, the room falls silent, as if someone has just brushed past their souls. Not horrific pain, but a pull they cannot ignore, a presence once dismissed now speaking in a way no one dares interrupt. A middle-aged woman bows her head, clutching her purse tighter. A young student presses a hand to their chest, eyes fixed on the bronze plaque. An elderly ex-officer leans against the wall, eyes closed as if questioning whether he ever overlooked a similar moment. No one speaks, and they don't need to. In the guest book, near the exit, there are hundreds of signatures, hundreds of brief notes, but one stands out, a piece of paper folded into quarters, written in light blue ink. I once thought a dog couldn't change the law, but now, I think, precisely because it couldn't speak, society was forced to listen. At the bottom, signed J.R. Former Officer. No one knows exactly who that is, but the curator says the note is always put back after each cleaning, even though someone once took it home. It's as if the museum chooses to remain silent rather than display that as proof. At night, when the doors close, the tech staff usually don't turn off that audio clip. They let it play softly in the empty room like a form of watchfulness. A sound once ignored now anchors a collective memory about a dog that never howled a second time but didn't need to. Since then, every howl like it heard somewhere in the city in someone's heart carries the weight of a question: who has the right to pull the trigger and who dares to stop? Jasper didn't speak, but the answer is clear. That's why its name remains on the bronze plaque, in people's hearts. In the timely pauses somewhere on a day no one recalls the event, but still remembers the gaze of a creature that never flinched when facing power. That is the end of a name that couldn't speak but made an entire society speak for it. A 6th grade student wearing an oversized olive jacket for his small shoulders stood for a long time before the bronze plaque engraved with Jasper's name. He said nothing, didn't ask his parents, and ran after friends, moving on to the next exhibit. When everyone else gradually left the small room, he quietly approached the guest book on a wooden table by the wall where pages bear the fingerprints and tears of hundreds before him. He wrote with a child's shaky but firm handwriting, "The dog didn't win, but it didn't die in vain, because someone stood beside it without bowing, and the whole world didn't look away." No one instructed him to write that. No one asked. Yet, somehow the story had etched itself deep inside him, not through moral lessons, not through viral videos, but through a silence that carved itself into memory like a scar. That story, which began on an otherwise ordinary morning in the park, did not end at the courtroom, did not stop at the cemetery, nor close at the museum built in remembrance. It spread beyond time and place, flowing through classrooms, seminars, police corridors, and families who once believed they had nothing to do with justice. It carried no loud anger, no recycled slogans. What it carried was the persistence of a name, Jasper, repeated not because the animal was extraordinary, but because its death could no longer be seen as ordinary. People speak its name not out of sorrow, but to redraw the line between allowed to do and ought to do, between power and righteousness. No music plays when that 4-second audio clip sounds in the museum. No spotlight shines on the plaque, no guide narrates. And perhaps that is why people pause, pay attention, and listen differently, listening with intuition, as if every time that sound echoes it awakens a memory of something society once overlooked the right to exist, of those weaker, quieter, and often dismissed as unworthy of voice. That 6th grade boy wasn't the first to write something that made the curator stop and read twice, nor surely the last, but his words folded in every letter stand as proof that the story doesn't close with death. It continues, with a name Jasper repeated as an unofficial ritual by those who once unknowingly helped silence become acceptance. And now they choose to repeat that name not to create a legend, but to remind themselves not to forget why such a legend never needed to be made had things gone right from the start. Jasper never knew how to speak, but the world spoke for him. And when a child who never lived through that moment writes lines heavier than any editorial, it proves this: some names need no story, only a glance, a timely act, and someone willing to stand beside without bowing. Because sometimes victory isn't about survival or reward. It's about making an entire system stop, listen, and change, even if only by the 4-second choked howl of a dog. And that's enough for a name, though silent, to become a legacy. The story of Jasper and Malarkey is not just about a dog or a single soldier. It's the story of a society forced to confront itself when faced with the unjustifiable death of a creature that cannot speak, and the unwavering gaze of a man who chose to stand tall at the line between justice and power. Malark Allen, a former Delta Force commander, needed no medals or applause to know he did the right thing. In his profound silence, the world heard a wordless challenge, a powerful presence that required no weapons or shouting. He held his ground, sending the message that sometimes silence and steadfastness are stronger than the loudest battles. Travis Kroll, the man who shot Jasper, was not merely a lawbreaker or a rogue officer. His actions reflected a larger system where power is given to those who lack understanding of limits, where bias and prejudice overshadow fairness and dignity. The sentence handed down to Travis marked the beginning of necessary change, but it was not the end. The truth of Jasper's death and Malark's journey touched the hearts of millions, awakening those who hesitated and those who had yet to stand up for what is right. Their story spread not only across social media, but deeply into classrooms, workshops, and legal discussions. It became a vivid testament to the power of small but meaningful acts, like Malark's steady gaze, Jasper's silence, and the choice of people like Jaden Roy, who stepped out of the sidelines. The story teaches us that power must be governed by ethics that everyone is responsible for, ensuring silence does not become complicity, and that change begins with the courage to face the hardest truths head-on. Through this journey, we realize justice is not always enforced through violence or loud words, but can start with a steady look, a brave act standing against wrong even when small. Real change begins with recognizing the value of every life, human or animal, and that no one should be left behind due to apathy or prejudice. The story also reminds us that each of us can make a difference by refusing to ignore even the smallest injustices and by daring to speak the truth no matter the difficult consequences. Jasper may no longer be in this world, but its name and story live on in people's hearts, becoming a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and silent courage. Malark never claimed to be a hero, But through his silence and actions, we learn that true heroism doesn't require titles or medals. It's about having the courage to uphold dignity when everything around you could bring you down. The story closes, but its message expands like a reminder that in every society, justice is never guaranteed. It must be protected and nurtured. It doesn't come from individual or organizational power, but from the unity of those who listen, speak up, and act at the right moment. It is a lesson in perseverance, the power of silence and lasting change without loud fanfare. Through Jasper and Malark's story, we also see the power of media and social networks, not just as channels for spreading information, but as tools to awaken conscience, build social consensus, and force leaders to reconsider how they operate. It shows that in the digital age, everyone can be a voice for justice, and every small act can become a flame, illuminating the darkest corners of injustice. As witnesses, we must learn not to look away when truth is hidden, to stand up when wrong occurs, and to preserve the most fundamental values of dignity and justice. Because, as the story teaches us, it's not only loud protests that change the world, but steadfastness and weighty silence that make entire systems awaken and transform. This is the journey of fairness, of courage without showmanship, of unwavering gazes and steps that never retreat. It's a journey each of us can begin by daring to face, speak out, and defend what is right, no matter how small or persistent the effort, because in the end, justice is not granted. It is preserved and fought for through stories like this.